Welcome to week 7. The theme for this week is STEM, STEAM and digital approaches. So we get to look at integrated science approaches this week. The integration is obviously a contested space. We know that science, technology, engineering, mathematics are 4 ways of looking at what we call the hard sciences or the high technical sciences. And you've then got STEAM, which is a softening through the adding of the arts or the creative domain. And digital approaches, of course, which are part of our responsibilities as teachers and something you'll be assessed on as a graduate when you start to talk about your portfolio on graduation and how you incorporate technology into your teaching domain. So we're going to explore these themes this week and look at STEM, STEAM and digital approaches as contested spaces, as dynamic spaces, and as spaces which we can hopefully learn a lot and explore a lot. So what I'll do is just select my highlighter for this week, and so that we can actually highlight key things. So what we're going to try and do this week is identify what STEM interactions really are. Now, we know that STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, but we also know, most of us being trained in primary teaching, that in fact engineering has no place, no role at all, no mention in the primary curricula. Even to some degree up to year 10, it's starting to be mentioned in the redesign arts curricula and also the design curricula, but by and large it has no place in the primary framework. The second thing we're going to look at is how STEM subjects link to real-world scenarios, and this is an agreed area that all STEM subjects ought to have a real-world application, what we call authentic learning. So they're basically pitched within authentic learning paradigms. We've got to appreciate that STEM learning opportunities require an elaborate context. And when we look at this, what we're talking about here is a passage towards project-based learning. So really, a truly integrated range of disciplines should have quite a deep pool to swim in. In other words, we should be not just doing a term and a subject, we should be doing an integrated project where students get to demonstrate and explore a whole range of learning modalities that they can actually explore and enjoy. We're going to look at the role of technology in STEAM. Now notice this has changed from STEM to STEAM. So STEAM actually adds a new dimension. STEAM is where students bring problem solving to the framework. And some of the models that fit in here that we've looked at previously is the LEGO 4C model, problem-based learning fits in here, education for sustainability fits in here, where kids actually have the opportunity to design solutions to real-world problems based on an integrated exploration of those problems through science, technology, engineering and mathematics. Another thing we want to explore is that science and technology, engineering, arts and mathematics, the team all view the world differently. Now, arts is primarily and traditionally a creative and innovative domain. It has been, if you like, the insightful domain, which has enabled us to view the world in different ways. Science has been an interpretive domain. Technology has been also what we call a design domain, but it's been a design-back domain where technology actually repeats back to us things that we perhaps identify in nature initially. Engineering is problem-solving, and mathematics, of course, is relational and computational. So we've got different world views competing here. So this is a contested space. And when there's a contest, there's winners and losers. And for that reason, our final goal this week is to identify the way that STEM curricula can sometimes undermine scientific process. The interesting thing is STEM was created to create greater participation in science. What it does, in actual fact, is perhaps undermine pure science learning and inquiry. And this is an interesting heuristic here, this diagram. Yes. Along this particular left-hand axis, we've got content, discipline, and integrative capacity. So all of these are different paradigms for viewing how education is presented. Along the bottom axis here of this particular pyramid, we've got the different, if you like, tribes and territories of the curriculum, the different degrees of integration. At the bottom, it's very content specific and it's very non-integrated. We can see very, very clear concepts here in physics, biology, chemistry, space, geoscience, biochemistry, very, very separate discourses. Here in the technology, again, a lot of separate discourse. We've got the technology of agriculture, of biomedical tech. We can see it broken down in our universities and our workplaces quite dramatically. The tribes and territories of these disciplines are strong. Engineering is the same, mathematics is the same, and arts, of course, we know we've got music, we've got physiology, we've got creative, we've got the humanities, we've got the liberal arts. All of these different disciplines have tribes and territories within them. In that way, we view them sometimes as silos. And the silos, for instance, can in fact be quite separate. And for many centuries in modern education, and Western thought have actually gotten further apart in their thinking. Once many of them were integrated. For instance, the arts were the home, for instance, to science, to technology, engineering, and mathematics. Since then, they've all splintered off. Since then, we now view them as somehow equal, or in current content and curricula, we sometimes view the arts as slightly inferior. Hence the emergence of STEM. Let's have a multidisciplinary, integrated worldview that is going to connect to economy, to human economy and industrial economy. So in other words, teaching and learning are explicitly connected through the act of work. Powerful message. Whether you accept it or not, I don't know. And if you have a look, the arts is left out of that. And yet we know that a great deal of industry, a great deal of endeavour, a great deal of innovation would not take place without creative enterprise, and creative enterprise is embedded in our arts. If we look at a full integration of them, we come with STEAM. And STEAM basically is an integration of each of these paradigms, picked, hand-picked, if you like, grazed, henpecked, if you like, where we get the best out of each. We integrate it into a problem-solving curricula with a real-world focus, and the aim is a STEAM curricula. And this can happen at a collective level, industry, groups, design level, collaborative level. It can happen also at an individual level with what we call makerspace technology. But what we're heading towards is a lifelong holistic view of learning, which is centered on problem solving, and that problem solving is somehow connected to innovation capacity. Let's look at it as we go through. In the ebook this week, it's really important that we look at the ebook this week, and I encourage you all to spend some time there. It begins from a very challenging perspective. We have a strong STEM culture in Queensland. We definitely do. The Palaszczuk government, in its second year in power, allocated $140 million to STEM champions within our schooling system, state school system. These were established through hubs. The hubs were then assigned to STEM champions. STEM champions came largely from existing school teacher populations, and those people were given a mandate to go out and promote STEM in schools. The same situation, Barack Obama in 2014 funded his STEM core. Now, when we look at this is a huge investment in dollars, a lot of career opportunities. There's another $81 million here set aside by the Queensland government for technology support as well. So it's not just STEM. But people had to go out and create this wonderful new STEM agenda. And I actually have a few friends here in Townsville who, unfortunately, their acronym is STEM PISS. You know, they're STEM professionals in schools, in state schools. So it's a really unfortunate acronym. But you know, they also, some of them are paid, some are volunteers, and some are actually subsidised by industry to go into schools and work as STEM professionals. But let's face it, is STEM a real thing, or is it just a fad? Now, Dennis Goodwin raised the prospect of STEM being just a fad. It actually undermines pure science inquiry. And the whole purpose of STEM, if you get into the subject website this week, is to actually promote participation in science. Now, we know from PISA 2012, 2015, 2018, we're starting to see Australia slip backwards in world rankings. Our participation in science is dropping off. Currently, our industry predictions are that we're 100,000 places short of ICT professionals in 3 years' time. So we're going to have to import our knowledge workers. Somehow STEM's going to solve that problem. I don't know how, but somehow it is. But I dare you, reach out and touch a handful of STEM. Grab it, massage it, taste it, smell it. What does it look like? Rub it in your hair. The reality is it doesn't exist. And, you know, will more students doing STEM subjects actually lead to an increase in STEM professionals? There's no reason to believe it will. There is no evidence to support that. There is no evidence to even support what is STEM. It really is a relationship of convenience. And, you know, if we want to quote Donald Trump, everyone else is, it sounds like fake news to me. So I currently have a research project looking at this, and it's producing some very interesting results. Most teachers, particularly primary school teachers, will not have a clue what STEM is. It's something, in their words, somebody else does. So we've got Sir Kenneth Robinson on the subject Moodle this week. Have a look at Sir Kenneth if you haven't already. He is just brilliant. And he reaches this really compelling and poignant solution. He's a very poignant thinker. I believe our only hope for the future is to adopt a new conception of human ecology. Okay, not STEM. Human ecology that's an economic ecology, STEM, one in which we start to reconstitute our conception of the richness of human capacity. Listen to this, powerful. Our education system has mined our minds in the way that we strip mine the earth for a particular commodity. And for the future, it won't serve us. We have to rethink the fundamental principles on which we're educating our children. So please have a look at the ebook this week. We take you from South Park, the 4 characters of South Park, Stan and his dad, and the whole role of IT, right through to why we are getting STEAMY, why we as teachers aren't getting STEAMY. We're starting to bring the arts back because, let's face it, most teachers warm to art. Very few teachers warm to STEM. Most teachers don't know what STEM is. But when we look at the STEM process of creativity, modelling, testing, hypothesising, retesting, coming up with a product or an outcome that's fit for purpose, and then being able to share and distribute that purpose through the act of presentation or performance, that's what STEM is. Art has been doing that for a very, very long time. In the words of Leonard Bernstein, we're trying to bring up where we can useful thinkers, and Bernstein is one of these people. In the 1950s, he said, the point is, art never stopped a war and never got anybody a job. True. That was never its function. Art cannot change events, but it can change people. It can affect people so that they are changed, because people are changed by art, enriched, ennobled, encouraged. There we are. They act in a way that may affect the course of events by the way they vote, the way they behave, the way they think. That is the nature of the arts. And this is really what we're trying to do with STEM. STEM is getting to try and change the way people act, vote, behave, and think, except they're trying to drive it along innovation, and they're trying to drive it along economy, and they're trying to drive it along global citizenship goals. It's a noble attempt, but will it last? Who knows? We've gone through some major shifts in education. The first one I want to talk about is the E-shift. And some of the key things here that to draw out. We've gone from singular reading to reading as a team sport. Social media. We know that for a start. It's very obvious, and many people contribute to it, but it's changed the nature of reading. We've gone from books to books. We no longer read to be enlightened, but we read to belong, to demonstrate our membership. What we know, what we've contacted, we've gone from page turning to key tapping. We now power browse. We don't read things and analyse them. We look at linked fragments of text to who's saying what, and to follow different people. We no longer follow an argument. We follow linked fragments of people. We used to have a single focus on technology. Now we've got interruption technologies. You can be sitting there minding your own business, and all of a sudden CNN will drop onto your screen. All of a sudden something else, where your text will fragment and take you off in a direction where you can refer to this or refer to that. We used to have an oasis of bookish tranquility. The old days where you'd sit back and actually enjoy reading for peace. These days, we've got a space of digital interactivity. When you get into a text, a digital text, there's no peace and quiet. There are no correct answers. In order to get any answers at all, you've got to be learning to promote better questions. And this is BG. The life before Google was all about correct answers. Now it's about better questions. And the challenge for us as educators is we've moved from a coverage culture to a learning culture. We used to be content-driven, test-oriented, and all about packages. Pencil and paper, imitative routines. Do this, replicate this. I show you, you show me. Okay, we tick the box. Now we've got a learning culture where we're building capacity through inquiry. Personalised learning plans, personalised questions, personalised inquiry tasks. Students are self-managed. They've got to have the skills as well as the capacity. It's all about the journey. Did I get my journey right? I go retest. I go and apply it to a new situation. So it's moving from the virtual and the real, where both have equal status. It's open-ended and it's creative. And we've moved also from what we considered to be knowledge work. Once upon a time, it was all of these things. It was certain what knowledge was. It was agreed. Evidence supported the right way. It was largely an individual process. Okay, and it was also the social context was largely irrelevant. Knowledge is as knowledge was. It just stood up. Now we live in an environment of dynamic knowledge, where everything is tentative. It's true until it's not. It's accurate till it breaks down. It's often contested. The whole nature of STEM. Is it science? Is it technology? Is it engineering or maths? Well, actually, we'll just call it STEM and we'll just agree to disagree. The evidence base is often weak for these things. We're bringing them in, we're exploring them, we're giving them permission to exist, but often the evidence base, we're trying to create the evidence base for it at the same time as we're implementing it. So it's very much about real testing. And when we look at this, it's collaborative in its production, therefore. And when we start something out, often it changes direction. Often it becomes something that was not intended to be because of the nature of collaboration. So the social context is irrelevant. Is relevant, is very relevant, because something is true in this case, but not true in that case. Okay, whereas it used to be true apart from situation. So we're facing a very, very different learning world as teachers. And this is what we call an epistemological shift, and it's all based on a body of knowledge we call spatial theory. Now, spatial theory is applied from everything from geography through to networked learning or even network systems. We used to look at, for instance, education as tribes and territories and disciplines. We now look at them as learning spaces, and those spaces exist at points in time. And they also exist geographically amongst different groups, and they also exist culturally and aesthetically. Some people have the opportunity to belong to some groups, others don't. So spatial theory has shed a lot of light on what we know about learning. So we now have teachers. Once upon a time, we're teaching in truth mode, and now teaching in design mode. And this is what Sir Kenneth Robinson talks a lot about, where knowledge used to be, again, all of these things, the good old days, an accumulation of facts. Facts are organised into silos and disciplines. Instruction is how we become voiced in the priesthood of that particular discipline. Memory and imitation are the ways that we actually acquaint ourselves with those practices. And we either are in or we're out, answers are right or wrong. We can be tested on our membership, okay, and success will determine, in the test will determine the degree of our membership. And of course, our best evidence of learning is often in exam results. We're moving away from this dramatically. We're moving towards design mode learning, where we're looking at, for instance, what an idea might be good for. And this is inquiry process, isn't it? What does it do and fail to do? Does it have a future? How could it be improved? And what is the value added of a particular concept? So to explore that this week and to introduce you to assessment task number 2, I'm going to talk to you about this notion of a flipped classroom. Now, rather than do it myself, I'm going to bring along a guest, Russell Stannard. And by that I mean I've actually got his videos to show you little excerpts from them to excite you, because Russell also features this week in our Moodle clips. So please do have a look at Russell's videos online. But the flipped classroom is essentially a blended learning strategy, and the aim is to improve student engagement and learning outcomes. It's not a new concept. I mean, once upon a time, I suppose we called it homework. But what it really means is it's equated with pedagogy such as active learning, peer instruction, case-based or problem-based learning. And what it does, it actually gets us to go out and investigate pre-learning phases. That is, learning in situations prior to the classroom and the teaching actually taking place. So we'll talk more about this in a minute. It's not a new concept. I just want you to understand that it comes from a rich background of learning, but has been reinvented. It's been made sexier by the integration of technology and the digital affordances that actually enables us to take place. The role of the teacher is critical. When we looked at week 5, we actually talked about engaging learners, and the whole principle there was to look at the 5 E's model, and we also looked at the principles and methods of engagement. Now, we know that the teacher has a major role in shaping the conditions in which students can become engaged in their own learning, and that's essentially what we've explored through the first 5 weeks of this particular course. Some of the principal ways they do this is through exploration discovery. We look at the 5 E's model. The students, and teachers can co-create this exploration discovery journey. It's about knowledge creation and knowledge sharing. The teacher determines where this happens, how it happens, the constructivist implications of the 5 E's. Collaboration and contribution, again, how do students collaborate? How do they contribute? How is this geared towards assessment and understandings? And of course, ultimately, where does the assessment finish up? What authentic real-world applications does it have? So this is a really important role for the teacher, and it really is the focus of assessment task number 2. We're actually looking to see why inquiry learning is such a valuable tool, why it can add such a rich dimension to the student's learning experience. And the role of the teacher, these 4 aspects are a major shift. We used to see learning as responding to instructions based on pre-selected study materials. Learning now is about activities, and learners become co-designers for themselves and others by moving through a series of learning activities. And we're now, in this week, we're starting to move towards that digital paradigm. Assessment task 1, yes, it involved a lot of digital skills. At Pedagogical, some people moved into video production, which was fantastic. But the purpose here is to now actually say to you as a teacher, when I graduate, one of my standards is actually technology. Am I going to have some examples to include in my portfolio at my teaching interview to demonstrate that I actually can incorporate technologies, that I can use technology to add value to learning, and I can do it in a meaningful way? So that's the purpose here. That's the beauty of including a task like this, to produce some digital cards which looks at networked technologies. Okay, we're not talking about specific high-end technologies, these are network technologies. Education Queensland has quite low-level technology. And a matter of fact, there's a whole lot of security and safety issues around some of the network technologies that forces Education Queensland to actually ban them within the classroom and within school settings. But we're talking about interactive learning, essentially web environments, and we're going to look at the appropriate tools that teachers can use to create ICT-rich environments, and of course to use those pedagogies to encourage and support deep learning. Gregson, 2012. Table 9.2, part of this week's work, looked at effective teaching strategies, and this is a great place for us to start this discussion, because let's not do teaching that's not effective. Let's embrace those strategies that are evidence-based, that actually show us, Neely's work in particular, how teaching strategies can add to learners' experiences. And here are the top 5. As you can see here, enhanced context strategies. So these are the sorts of things about problem-based learning, field trips, the schoolyard lessons, encouraging reflection, really meaningful learning. And this has the highest effect size when we look at adding value to learning. The effect size being 1.5, which is a really strong result. Collaborative learning, we can see here one of the brainchilds of Dennis Goodrum and the Australian curriculum. Okay, putting students in group work, getting them to tease through misconceptions, getting them to look at lab exercises, inquiry process, having discussion as a grounded part of that process. Collaborative learning is a very, very effective strategy. The research supports it. And these effect sizes come from Neely's study in 2005, which is what we call a meta-analysis. Neely actually looked at a whole range of 30 years of research prior to this paper, and he summarised it all as a meta-analysis of all of that research to look at the learning effect of different teaching strategies. Questioning, good old Bloom, okay, still holds true. The third most impactful strategy is really well timed, really well structured, really good cognitive questioning. Okay, and we've been talking about that again in weeks 1 to 5. Inquiry strategies, again, a little bit related to number 2, collaborative learning, because they all pursue the inquiry model, but they're student-centred. Have a look at the definition of inquiry. Inductive instructional activities where students are working through their own inductive reasoning by interacting with real-world scenarios in guided ways, in laboratory studies, and also through indirect studies as well. So we can see that these great constructivist models, we can see them all here, are really, really significant and effective learning strategies. The final thing, the one that stands out probably, is manipulation strategies. It's a little bit different to the other 4. And so it's the opportunities to work or practice with physical objects. And herein, of course, we can throw our technologies. So the first 4, we can see, are really rich in deepening understanding and higher order learning. This 5th one is really about expression, is about working with physical objects, operating apparatus, technology, developing skills using simulations, drawing, CAD, constructing something. Less effect, but once given, as a culminating task, you can see here the role for summative assessment as a manipulation strategy, getting the students to come up with a project, to design a product, to do something in that sort of real-world context is a very, very good summative learning task. So one of the key things about flipping the classroom, it embraces all of those 5 learning strengths. And rather than talk about it myself, you hear enough of my voice in this course, I'm going to introduce 2 people to you, Russell Stannard, and in the Moodle this week, I've actually put references to his videos there where you can go and see the whole lot of them. You can access them as a library. You can subscribe and have a look at all of his work. I'm not saying Russell's brilliant, but he's just got the time and patience to put all of this on video and open a library and promote himself as a consultant in that field. But his stuff is quite good. He talks about flipping the classroom and disrupting learning. We'll get onto that in a minute. And Nathaniel Bott is a Year 10 student from Hobart. Now, he's a little bit older than some of the students we'll teach, but when we see his perspective, I'm sure you can understand why I've included him here, because he can actually tell you a little bit. He does a TED presentation, and he talks a little bit about his learning in this environment. So let's get cracking. The flipped classroom, here we go, Russell Stannard. And I'll just actually get rid of my eraser.
Producing flipped classroom content. Now, despite the fact that the flipped classroom would seem to be something that was invented perhaps maybe about 10 years ago, I remember going out to America in 2009 and being involved in a flipped classroom conference. In fact, the roots of it come from something called the inverted classroom, and in the inverted classroom was a very similar idea. That is the idea of the students preparing and doing work at home so that in the classroom the teacher could spend more time doing kind of group work and pair work and more activities that process the language. So in fact it's got...
Now, it's Russell here is actually giving the background to the flipped classroom. And again, we'll just hear him out on it, and we'll talk a little bit about his perspective when he's done.
Home, so that in the classroom the teacher could spend more time doing kind of group work and pair work and more activities that process the language. So in fact it's got its roots in something called the inverted classroom. But perhaps the reason why the flipped classroom has become well known is because of the affordances of technology. What's happened in the last 15-20 years particularly, though of course technology's been around for a long time, but what's happened in the last 15-20 years as there's been a huge introduction with the advent of Web 2.0 and the possibilities of learning management systems, screen capture, putting video on the internet, etc. Lots of different ways now that technology can be incorporated into teaching and learning. So it's the combination of these 2 things together that have created a scenario where the flipped classroom is a possibility.
Now, bear in mind, what we mean by the flipped classroom literally is a classroom taken out of context. So instead of having the students come into the classroom to do the learning, the students are doing learning before they come into the classroom. Think of Bloom's taxonomy. Think of the lower level, the comprehension levels, where you can do an awful lot of work with students before they enter a classroom, and that's going to give you more time, what we call the affordances. It creates time, the time benefits of using a flipped classroom model. It means you can work deeper at the language, interaction and constructivist interface with learners in their own presence. So we're flipping the classroom, we're creating more opportunities to do deeper teaching and learning. So why are we doing assessment task number 2? Here we go, we're doing digital cards, we're talking about creating a repository for learning and building a learning sequence.
Focus on here a little bit is the technology, and I think this is where there's been a lot of misunderstanding. Flipping your classes does not mean that you need to learn loads of technologies, and let me try to explain why. First of all, you need a central repository. You need somewhere where all of your learning content is organized so that when the students go home, they can go to week 1 folder or week 2 folder or week 3 folder. They can find the materials, they can listen to the videos, listen to the podcasts, etc., and do the activities that you've set them. As I've said, sometimes you may even ask them to go off and find the materials. But you will certainly need a central repository. Now, there are all sorts of repositories that you could use. If you're looking for a free one, it might be something like Schoology or Edmodel. If you are working in an institution, you might have Blackboard, or you might have something like Moodle. So you need a central repository where all that content is organized. But you're also going to need, of course, the content. Now, a lot of the content you're going to find. Teachers are becoming more adept at finding technologies of videos, podcasts, articles on the internet that they can make use of with their students. And that's certainly happening. There will be times when you will need to make your own material. So this is the key point. Most of the time, or a lot of the time, you will find material and you will put it into your repository. Sometimes you will need to make material. Now, if we looked at a lot of flipped classroom and we looked at the material, a lot of the self-made material that's in a flipped classroom will be using screencasts. So the point I'm trying to make here is that there are really two key technologies that you're going to need to flip your classroom. A repository to organize all your learning, Edmodo, Schoology, Moodle, Blackboard, and there are many other learning management systems or virtual learning environments. But you're also going to need to learn a couple of technologies. And the one that I would definitely recommend is to learn to screencast. Screencasting is exactly what we're doing here on the screen now. I am recording myself giving this presentation. Learning to screencast, learning to record anything that you open up onto your screen and turn it into a learning resource is essential. And when I do flipped classroom training, these are the two things that I focus on: teaching the teachers, or helping the teachers to learn to use a repository. Normally it might be Edmodo or Schoology, or sometimes Moodle if I'm working in an institution that has Moodle. Secondly, the ability to screencast, the ability to do exactly what I'm doing now on the screen. Just those two technologies, just knowledge of those two technologies, along with knowledge of all the learning material that's available on the internet, and being very resourceful in terms of finding that material, so being good at searching on Google, for example, is enough to build a really effective flipped classroom course.
Right, so just to top and tail that, I mean, we don't need to be experts at technology in order to use it appropriately for teaching. Russell has pointed out we do need to be able to create a repository in order to store our materials and house it and curate it. That's the term that we tend to use these days. And it's good to be able to become skilled at screencasting, which is exactly what I'm doing now. It's not rocket science. It's involving a PowerPoint slideshow. I'm embedding materials in that slideshow and essentially talking to it in real time, recording it and posting it to YouTube, where it's accessed by you as a screencast. The repository, you may think, I don't have a learning management system. I don't want to pay for it. You don't need to. There are things like Weebly. Weebly are free, and it is free. There are wiki spaces which are free, and all you do is you create a space, you embed your resources there, you create your learning digital card, and you link your digital card to your Weebly or wiki, where it's a stable environment, where it's going to work on time every time, which is what you need for teaching, and therefore your digital card will become fully operative. So we're looking here at flipping our classroom. We're looking at gaining some affordances through technology, where we can use technology to support our learning and create higher order engagement. More from Russell.
This is a pretty common definition that you will see that's pretty good, but it's quite interesting to think that in a way this is beginning to evolve and change, and later on I will talk about this. But what we're talking about is we define the flipped classroom as an educational technique. That's a really important word, educational technique. It's not a methodology, it's a technique. It's a way of organising learning. It's a form of blended learning. That's really important. And it has two parts. The interactive group learning activities in the classroom. This is really true. What we're trying to do is make the classroom time more interactive, more group work, more pair work, more working on tasks, more using the knowledge that the students have picked up, have learned, have absorbed. And then the second part is, well, what we call the lower order thinking skills, going home, learning the basics around a particular subject, so that in the class you can begin to process that language and to be able to actually, or process those ideas, whatever the topic has to be, and to actually use it and to function with it and work with it and link it to other things that you know. So there's got two parts to it. Now, one of the interesting things is that this is beginning to change. In other words, yes, the students go home, yes, they go online, they watch videos, etc., but we can actually make that part of the learning also more group work based, and we'll.
Which is really interesting. Russell's pointing there to the emergences and developments within technology itself, and social media too, because it's not uncommon that kids will go home and engage in flipped learning activities, and one of the first things they'll do is contact each other in social media and set up their own little discussions and use that as a discussion and back channel for sharing ideas. So we get the idea of what the flipped classroom is. We understand why we're doing it. We've got an assessment task coming up requiring us to create 2 digital cards, one for each different age group. We've got to have a stable repository in which we can put our materials, and we've got to have an interactive digital card which is going to take learners there to engage in a structured sequence of learning. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. Let's go on and have a look at some of the other concepts we can talk about and introduce the notion of Bloom's taxonomy here, because Bloom is directly relevant. We've got 2 different activities happening, parallel activities. We've got interactions in class, and we've got direct computer work out class. And we can also add a third dimension to that if we want, that is computer-mediated communication outside of class as well, or inside class as well, inside class with external communities, experts, communities overseas, other groups. We can actually extend the boundaries of the classroom. Oops, let's try this one.
We'll talk a little bit. When we look at the flipped classroom, we often talk about Bloom's taxonomy, and I must admit I'm a big fan of Bloom's taxonomy. The idea behind Bloom's taxonomy is that often when we learn something, we first of all learn the basic concepts. So let's say it was a history. We would learn the basic concepts of, say, perhaps the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire. But then later we might then begin to apply that knowledge. We might compare, for example, the fall of the Roman Empire with the fall of the British Empire, or with the fall of the Soviet Union. We might look at, see if there are any parallels between the two. We begin to actually use that knowledge and link it with other knowledge. We begin to apply and analyze it and understand it better. So we move from sort of lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. And that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about using the flipped classroom. The students go home, they learn the basic concepts, they probably do a few quizzes or simple activities to check their basic comprehension, then they come into the classroom and then we try to activate that knowledge, we try to use it. For example, it might be in a language learning context where the students go home and they learn some basic vocabulary, perhaps they look at that vocabulary in context, perhaps they do a few exercises at home to check their basic understanding of that vocabulary, but then in the classroom we begin to process and use that vocabulary in a context and get them to actually speak or do an activity where they would practice that vocabulary. So we move from lower order thinking to higher order thinking. So for me, there is a strong link between the flipped classroom and Bloom's taxonomy, and it's very much about distributing the teacher's time more effectively.
When we talk about distributing the teacher's time, let's face it, we go home and 65-70% of your class are able to do the basic comprehension and knowledge work. A small percentage of students are not. You get into the classroom the next day, you can set the inquiry and process tasks for those students who are able to get the concepts, and then you can go back and you can do some diagnostic and baseline assessment with the students whose concepts are blurred and who are not getting it. So it actually is a teaching support tool, and that's how we're looking at it. The next thing we're going to look at redesigning. Russell will talk a little bit about combining learning theories here.
So in a way we could argue that we're sort of looking at 2 theories about learning and bringing them both together into the flipped classroom, because the students are going to go home and they're going to read an article or listen to a lecture or listen to a podcast or read a blog or whatever, and they're perhaps going to just check their basic understanding. And we could almost argue that that is a very sort of behaviorist approach to learning. So, you know, read something and check you understand it and try to get it in your mind through the quizzes and through the activities that you do on your own. So it's very much sort of a behaviorist approach to learning. But then when we bring the students into the class, we're kind of being more constructivist. We're creating tasks and activities that get the students to collaborate and work together and build their knowledge and process those lower order thinking skills. So in a way it kind of draws on 2 theories. One interesting thing, and this has come from my own experience of working on a few projects and a few master's degree students that have done research, is that often that part that the students do at home can actually be quite collaborative, because students might connect with each other on Skype and do an activity together, or they might use something like Google Docs to share content or Google Sites. And in fact, at the moment, I'm on a big project at the University of Berlin where the students precisely do that. They're working remotely from each other, but they go onto Google Sites and onto Google Docs and create the documents together. So though they're working on their own and preparing for the actual lesson, they're doing that collaboratively. So that's one of the big shifts in terms of the original definition of what the flipped classroom is.
Interesting model, isn't it? We can now see we've got the benefits of Vygotskian, in-depth, more capable other learning models in the classroom. We're creating more time to do that. We're creating greater definition and greater clarity. Today we're going to be looking at this based on the tasks that you completed last night. So we're getting much more structure in our classroom. We are redesigning learning in a pedagogical, with a new pedagogical approach.
Now, I just want to focus on 5 key points that really emerge from the points that I've made so far in terms of the way that the learning is organised. Firstly, the flipped classroom is a form of blended learning. When we're talking about the flipped classroom, we're talking about a blend. That is a combination of face-to-face teaching and using technology outside of the classroom. So it's a blend. It's a particular way of organising that blend, but it's a blend. Secondly, it means that to a degree, some of the teaching stuff is being moved out of the classroom and moved to home. Now, what do I mean by teaching stuff? Well, I call the teaching stuff when the teacher is basically passing knowledge to the students. That might be the teacher standing at the front of the class and explaining something about the Roman Revolution, or in a geography lesson talking about the formation of mountains, or whatever topic you're looking at. It could be language, you could be looking at vocabulary and vocabulary explanations. That teaching stuff, try to take some of that teaching stuff out of the class, and the students can go home and do that instead. So instead of me standing at the front of the class talking about the fall of the Roman Empire, I can get the students to go home and maybe watch a video or listen to a podcast or even read an article about that. And then in the class we can perhaps do some more comparative work, more project-based work, further investigation. As I said, students could then kind of move on to sort of more group-based pair work activities where they're beginning to actually use that knowledge. So we free up some of the class time, which previously we were using for teaching, and we use it more for group-based work, project work, etc. Now, it's a technique. It's not an approach to every single class. It's not appropriate in every single context. It works particularly well in some contexts. I found myself using it at certain points when it's worked really well, when it seems to work really well. So it's not something that you're always going to do, and there are lots of reasons why you might not do it always. One, are the materials available for the students to do the learning at home? Two, is the concept the type of concept that's easy to transfer to the students? So some concepts are quite complex and need more support from the teacher. So it does depend to a large degree also on the context, the material, etc. Now, one of the last points I want to make, and this is really interesting and an important point, is that the role of the student. The student's role sort of changes because the student now has to prepare for the lesson. So in a way, we could argue that we're going to obviously put more responsibility on the students in terms of their own learning. And a lot of people say, this ends up being a lot more work for the students. It doesn't necessarily have to be. They could go home and watch a 3 or 4 minute video about the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire, and then do a simple quiz or prepare a few slides so that they can do their own presentation in the classroom. It doesn't have to mean that there is a lot more work for the student to do at home. It's simply homework, but it's homework of a different nature. But what perhaps it is doing is encouraging the students to be more autonomous and more independent, and giving them a little bit more freedom.
Really important point to remember, because when we look at assessment task number 2, a digital card is not for every lesson. If you did that with your students, you'd soon find that they'll switch off. Essentially, they'll just think that you're really not present in the classroom as a teacher. So you've got to pace it. It's got to have what we call a pedagogical warrant. Okay, so it's got to be really, in this case, we'll talk about TPACK. It's got to be part of your TPACK. And we'll talk about that in a short while. But Russell's absolutely right. Flipping the classroom is a strategy. It's a technique. It's got a certain point at which you would use it, And therefore, the digital cards that you're going to use will have a certain pedagogical approach. Okay, you'd be using them for very, very clear pedagogical knowledge reasons. And that's important when we come to assessment task 2 to remember that. The final thing I want to talk about, I'll get Russell to talk about actually, he's doing a great job, is the digital affordances. This is why we do this.
Really, the fact that technology in terms of digital technology and the possibilities of things from the introduction of Web 2.0, etc., that have really allowed for this move from what I call the inverted classroom to what we perhaps talk about now in the flipped classroom. And it's worth thinking about it because, see, what you've got now are many different resources that are available to students that we can either create as teachers or we can access them. Now, more and more teachers are learning to access content that's been built by other people or created by other people and left on the internet. So there's podcasts and videos and screencasts and quizzes and all sorts of things. So it doesn't necessarily mean to say that the teacher has to make all this learning content, because much of it is already on the internet and available for people. And it also means that the teacher has to think very carefully about, well, what types of activities are they going to do in the classroom, because now it's going to be more around tasks and problem solving and activating that knowledge that the students have developed at home. So it requires new skills from the teacher. Teachers need to be good at finding content that they're going to share with the students for them to access at home, and in some cases they're going to need to also make content. And teachers are going to also need to think about how they devise activities in the classroom. And these are big challenges. They're not easy challenges for many teachers to take on.
Now, I want you to think about the future there. When we look at this, we're creating an environment where we're cutting learners free of the classroom. We're actually giving them license, enough rope, enough chain in which to free range and take care of their initial learning needs themselves, but to do it in a guided inquiry model. Now, that might ring a bell, guided inquiry. Okay, so when we're looking at digital cards, we're really talking about an inquiry process that's guided. Okay, and we can go back to the early parts, the first 5 weeks of this course, to explore that in a little more detail if we want. But Nathaniel Bott, it's about time to roll out Nathaniel and get him. He's a Year 10 student, and he talks to you about his perceptions of what it's like to learn in a more open, in a more inductive, in a more connected and integrated environment, primarily in a flipped classroom. Now, you don't always have to make your own resources. This is a really good point. You do need some capacity to make your own resources. And during the remainder of this, the remaining 5 or 6 weeks, I'll take you to some interesting sites. There's EdTV, there's TED, there's a whole range of resources available to you, designed by teachers, for teachers. And most unit that you can possibly imagine actually do already have some very, very good web resources. But here's Nathaniel. He's been on the learning end of this.
I believe that young people today are stuck in a learning experience which is boring, unengaging, a dated model that doesn't suit today's youth and doesn't necessarily prepare them for the world they're being educated for. Toffler, an American writer and futurist, believes that the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn.
That's an interesting perspective, isn't it? Here we have from the mouth of babes. Now, Nathaniel, we'll bring him up again sometime later in the course and look at some of the points he talks about. But Nathaniel points to this whole challenge facing us at the moment. How do we take our existing curriculum, which is creating disengagement? How do we remodel it, refocus it, and get it geared towards learners in a way that sustains them, challenges them, and actually gives them a pathway forward? So we'll talk a little bit more about this in the coming weeks. But it's time for us to look exactly at assessment task number 2. Now, I've had a couple of forum questions on this one already. My apologies, I haven't answered them yet. Basically, been so busy getting assessment task 1 all set up for marking, and your markers are busily chipping away in the background now as we're chatting. So assessment task number 2 is digital cards, and it's 2 parts to it. Let's explore this. Part A says it's worth 10 marks, and Part B is worth 30 marks. And there's also an additional 10 marks for your content knowledge as they apply to biological, earth and space sciences. We'll come to that further down. But Part A, using professional literature, write a brief comparison of 2 alternate pedagogies for science teaching. Write a brief 2 alternate pedagogies. Okay. And what this really asking you to do is describe two different pedagogies. So we've got the inquiry model is one pedagogy. Within the inquiry model, it can be broken down into a couple of different pedagogical models, the 5 E's, for instance, problem-based learning. You can have direct instruction. You can have a whole range of different models. Okay, up to you to decide which ones you're going to do. We'll talk much more about the literature review in coming weeks. Okay, now the aim is in your literature review is to actually make this literature review relevant to the two cards that you're going to develop. So if you're just going to pluck two random pedagogies to write about, bear in mind the marker ultimately will say to you, well, okay, well, what's the connection between your pedagogies and your cards? So implicit in here, it's hidden, but there's a very real expectation, an implicit assumption that you're going to identify and explore two pedagogies in part A, and then you're going to build on them in part B by showing how they work in digital cards. So one of those pedagogies may, for instance, be the 5 E's, and you may take the engage stage of that and look at teaching misconceptions. Another pedagogy, for instance, may be problem-based or play-based learning, and you may use the early years learning framework to use that for your digital card and bring that to life. And in part A, you would explain both pedagogies, you would explain what you were doing, how they operated, the key principles of them, the key strategies involved, some of the common pedagogical techniques used, and in part B, you would illustrate how they work in your digital card. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's talk about part B now. It's worth 30 marks, 2 cards, each worth 15. You've got to develop 2 digital cards, and they can be used to scaffold independent learning in science by small groups of students in a primary classroom and or early childhood classroom if you're an early childhood teacher. 2 cards, small groups, okay? The cards should demonstrate a clear understanding of the pedagogy selected in part A. There is the explicit connection, and use content from the 2 strands of biological and earth and space sciences. So one card should be biological, second, earth and space. There's a nice split. One card, if you're a primary teacher, should be upper primary, lower primary. One card, if you're an early childhood teacher, should be early childhood or early years program and early primary, years 1 to 3. They're your options. The rules, the card must be in digital format, and it should cover a range of activities. Include digital format means it's got to be in any sort of digital form. So it can be a Word document, that's digital form. It can be a hyperactive, hyperlinked digital document. So that makes it truly digital. Okay, whereas just a Word document really is just one-dimensional. It's not really interactive. So put the word interactive, it must be interactive, and it must also be printable. Because let's face it, if you're going to be using a card for early years learners in prep to year 3 classroom or even before that, it's probably going to need to be laminated. It's going to need to be smear-proof. It's going to need to be waterproof. It's going to need to be apple and biscuit proof. It's going to need a lot of things. And also think about if you're using the 0 to 5 year old learners, think about how you're going to present your information. Now, the literacy levels of those kids is going to be a lot less than kids in year 4, 5, and 6 of primary school or years 7 and 9 of the early secondary. So you may need to use icons, you may need to use images, you may need to make text a little bit redundant. Any instructions you have, any activities you give may need to be paired for use with parents at home or with family members. So you need to bear all of this in mind when you create your digital card. Now, there's a range of ways you can store in your digital card. You're going to link to simulations. You're going to link to podcasts. You're going to link to a range of activities. Think about how you're going to do that. There'll be videos you want to link to. Are you going to store those videos? Are you going to put your digital card online so students will actually have a card where you'll explain the task and then they just link to that task, which may be embedded in a wiki or a Weebly site that you've created, and they can go there directly. So we can see 10 marks for part A, 30 for part B, and then a global 10 marks floating for your content knowledge. That is how you link the biological and earth and space sciences to your year level, to your unit name or unit focus, and to the elaboration that you're targeting. So if you are actually looking at living things, how well do you make those links to the content knowledge of that living things unit and that living things elaboration? So it's quite a challenging task. It's putting you very much in the role of the teacher, in an imagined classroom, which you get to choose because, let's face it, there are some constraints. You've got to do a younger card and an older card, depending on no matter your early childhood or primary. But you have to do 2 cards, one at each end of your teaching curricula. And the reason there is, if you're registered for primary teaching in Queensland, you could teach up to year 9 in a secondary school. If you're registered for early years education, you could teach up to year 3 in a primary school or an integrated school or a P12. Or an early learning right through to 12 school, which there are many. So, the registration frameworks cover that. So let's have skills that match our registration requirements. Part A is the one that challenges a lot of students. People often come to a road, a fork in the road when they come to Part A, because it is meant to be highly referenced, this piece. When you're looking at Part A, you're doing your pedagogical review, 2 pedagogies. You've actually got to site resources. You've got to cite authority. You've got to locate your pedagogy and explain it thoroughly and justify its application. This is a good pedagogy because, okay, this pedagogy suits this learning group because, and you're obviously targeting it to reuse it in your digital cards. Now, Russell Standard presents some very interesting ideas on matching pedagogy to technology in the flipped classroom. Okay, he says, quite obviously and explicitly, it can't be used all the time. It's a technique that suits certain scenarios, doesn't suit every scenario. But the goal ought to be deeper learning, and the goal ought to be higher order thinking. So your digital cards may concentrate on the lower end of Bloom's taxonomy. You may justify that and the techniques and the learning sequence you've created in terms of your TPACK, your technological pedagogical content knowledge. And when you look at your TPACK, it's made up of 3 things. You've got your ACS strands and substrands, of course, and their contact, your contact knowledge is really the big part there. You've also got your applications and uses of technologies, your generic capabilities here and your generic standards as a teacher. Where would you use technologies? Which technologies are safe, which are reliable, and which are appropriate to your learning groups? And then you've got your pedagogical knowledge, your learning and teaching context. How are the 2 pedagogies you've selected and identified? How do they suit your year levels? How do they suit your context? How do they match the elaboration you're trying to deliver? How do you present it? Are you going to use icons, images? What technological tools and resources and digital artifacts are you going to repurpose and curate for the purpose of this particular digital card? So it really is quite a broad, quite a challenging and quite a demanding assessment task. Now, it's in 2 parts. Again, I'm just reiterating because I know I'll get questions about this. The first is an academic discussion, and Part B is a digital card, 2 of them featuring different pedagogies and strands. Okay, these are to be used for Part B. Now, pedagogy is a very broad term, just to give you an idea of what we mean. It exists long before the ACS, so it can be independent of the ACS. So you can choose a whole range of pedagogies to explore here. It can be play-based. It can be engagement pedagogies, productive pedagogies. It could be the 5 E's. It could be role plays. It could be narratives. It could be analogies. It could be inquiry-based approaches such as investigations, problem-based learning, models, simulations, making of videos. Okay, a little example here. In a 0 to 5 year card, you may use problem-based learning to teach a biological concept. For instance, your elaborations, okay, whatever elaboration you choose, maybe living things. It's going to be more integrated. Literacy, numeracy, and social interaction are going to be the focus in these 0 to 5 years, rather than content knowledge. And in the P to 3 years, you may explore the 5 E's to look at a primary unit in the Earth strands and science understandings. So a little example of how you may approach it from the early years. So 2 cards. Part A, an academic discussion, 2 pedagogies. One pedagogy should come to life in one of your cards. The other pedagogy should come to life in the second of your cards. If you're doing that, you cannot be criticised. You are justifying your cards, producing them, and showing how they work. That's what this task asks you to do. So the steps in designing your task. Okay, let's have a look here. We'll just go back and pick up our highlighter. And the first step, of course, we're going to build the digital cards itself. So in order to do that, you've got to identify your ACS strand, your early years substrands, whichever one you're going to use for each card. It may be the early years framework for your first card, the ACS for your second, and identify the relevant elaboration. Here you're working in your content knowledge, your CK. Look at the first D. Identify the likely misconceptions that are likely to come up for your students within this particular elaboration. Living things, maybe distinguishing between things that are living and non-living. Okay, so in there you're introducing your content and your pedagogical knowledge. Then go out and curate some digital resources. By that I mean browse and go to Scoodle. Have a look at a range of resources, see what's available, and see what you can find that may relate and connect directly to your content area. Have a look at the age grouping for those resources. Have a look at the simulations, ones that you think are going to work. Piece them together. Create a repository. It may be a wiki site in which you store them and make links to them. Okay? Start to put those resources together. Design an ICT platform is your next step. Okay? And as instructor, this is something you do. Here you do that with your learners in mind. Here you can now go and look and say, well, okay, what am I going to do? I've got these digital resources. I have this unit. I've got my first E. Okay, I know what the misconceptions are likely to be. I found these resources that can help me address those misconceptions. Okay, now I've got to identify a platform. What am I going to use? Am I going to use PowerPoint? Am I going to use video? What kinds of videos? Am I going to create any quizzes? Am I going to do any screencasts? What will the platform be that I need to use? Ultimately, I need a printable document. How am I going to link to it? How am I going to embed? Your next task is to actual production. When you come here, you've got to plan a learning sequence. Now, it's not a unit of study. We know a unit of study can go for weeks. This is a learning sequence. It could be 1, it could be 2, it could be 3, up to 5 lessons. Any more than that's getting a little bit long. Okay? But plan a learning sequence. Who are your learners? What is your elaboration? What is your substrand? What platform are you using? What ICT resources? What resources are you going to incorporate? Okay, and how are they now going to learn? What is the content, the knowledge and comprehension stages you want them to identify? Look at where your digital card fits in to this learning sequence. So you may, for instance, have a 3-lesson sequence. Your digital card may only be applicable at stage 1, the first E. Okay? It may only be applicable there. It may have further application. You may identify an elaboration, living and non-living, and then you may, for instance, set the students 3 inquiry tasks where your digital card will be the guided inquiry process. Identify links to classroom activities. So once you've got your digital card, how are you going to follow up in your classroom? Okay, identify that. So it's really important. So your digital card has got to serve a purpose of addressing and laying down your pedagogy, and then it's ultimately got to connect here to links back in the classroom, because this is what a flipped classroom does. The digital card has a purpose. It's a blended learning purpose. Then the Vygotsky space. You create space to learn, develop, extend, elaborate, and grow the classroom and grow the learning. Then you've got to look at your digital card. What am I going to need to do in order to make this card work well? Am I going to need to add glossary items? So that will there be words in there that students need? So will I need to put a glossary in? What are the explicit instructions I'm going to have to add? And you're doing all of this as an instructor with your learners in mind. What learning activities are going to put in place? What will it look like? What will I ask them to do? What will learning look like in this digital sequence? And okay, not everyone's going to work at the same pace. There's going to be differentiated outcomes here. What about the early finishers? What about the people who go slow? What is the minimum outcome I want from this digital card? What is the minimum level of understanding? Okay, what extension or inquiry tasks can I add to this to ensure that students who proceed and move through the learning sequence and master the learning sequence are then in a position to extend it and apply it so they can come to the classroom with even more questions, with even more engagement, with even greater higher levels of understanding. This is instalment number 1 for assessment task number 2. I'm going to stop here. I've said enough. I'm going to refer you now to go back to the Moodle and have a look at this week's work on STEM and STEAM and take it all on board and think about how you are going to create and manage and design and implement and ultimately evaluate your own digital cards.